This video is sponsored by Movie Palette.
Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Miles Morales is back as Spider-Man, and this time he's going across the Spider-Verse.
A year after Into the Spider-Verse, Miles Morales, voiced by Shameik Moore, is struggling to juggle his duties as Spider-Man with his responsibilities, much to the suspicion of his parents, Brian Tyree Henry's Jefferson Davis, and Luna Lauren Velez's Rio Morales. But the multiverse has not been fully closed, and Gwen Stacy, voiced by Hailee Steinfeld, visits Miles' world, having joined an interdimensional spider society trying to contain these portals, led by Oscar Isaac's Miguel O'Hara. But a new villain called the Spot, voiced by Jason Schwartzman, whose body is made up of holes he can use to travel between space and universes, potentially threatens the entire multiverse, and Miles follows Gwen into other worlds to stop him.
It's been 4.5 years since Into the Spider-Verse came out, and I think it's pretty much universally accepted that that movie is one of the best animated films come out in the last decade, and its influence on pop culture can be seen everywhere. For a start, it pretty much got the ball rolling for multiverses on film, which have been a big part of comic book movies ever since, particularly the MCU, but even in other kinds of movies like Everything Everywhere All at Once. It's pretty much Into the Spider-Verse that introduced audiences to that concept and mainstreamed it. And then you have its influence on other Spider-Man media, like No Way Home, which was pretty much a live-action attempt at trying to do Into the Spider-Verse, which was very successful in its own right, but not as groundbreaking as its predecessor. And its effects on Western animation cannot be measured. Spider-Verse's art style was so unlike anything that was seen at that time. Big studio animated films looked increasingly homogenized and very similar to each other in terms of their CG appearance, and now we're getting these animated films from the studios that have very distinctive art styles that really play around with their character designs and experiment in ways that they haven't for probably decades. That means the Spider-Verse follow-ups have a lot to live up to, and this is the first in a two-part sequel. It was actually going to be subtitled Across the Spider-Verse Parts 1 and 2, but the third movie, released next year, has been resubtitled Beyond the Spider-Verse. I mean, can't we get beyond Thunderdome? Anyway, most of the creative team from the original film are back, including most notably Phil Lord and Chris Miller, who are returning as writers and producers, but we do actually have 3 brand new directors on this outing, most notably Kemp Powers, who previously co-directed and wrote Pixar's Soul, as well as One Night in Miami. So the question with this hotly anticipated sequel is where they can actually top what they've done before and recapture the magic of the earlier movie. And guess what? They managed to swing a web right over it. I do have to admit that even though I loved the first movie, when I heard this was going to be a 2-part follow-up, I was very apprehensive. Not skeptical, but very cautious, to say the least, because Into the Spider-Verse was like a bolt of lightning. It came out of nowhere, and I imagine that kind of magic is very hard to recreate in one movie, let alone 2. But we also live in an age where studios, not uncommonly, pad out sequels so they can double dip the cash grab by making 2. And I'm not saying that's what's happened here, because clearly it isn't, but you'd imagine my trepidation at the idea of Spider-Verse potentially being stretched too thin. You look at something like The Matrix, which was equally groundbreaking back in its day. That did a 2-part follow-up, and that definitely felt like it wasn't strong enough to sustain the length of 2 movies. The Matrix Reloaded does have some points of comparison with Across the Spider-Verse, particularly the Burly Brawl. That reminds me a lot of the sequence in Across the Spider-Verse where Miles is getting chased by hundreds of spider people across that dimension. But what it actually reminded me of is the other big 2-part sequel, Back to the Future Part 2, which in its day was notoriously criticised for being too complicated in its plotting. If that came out now, that wouldn't even be an issue, especially because Across the Spider-Verse makes that movie look like kids' play by comparison. But certainly, they both treat their predecessors as jumping off points. We've set the characters, we've set the worlds and the concepts. Now, let's push those things as hard as we possibly can. Across the Spider-Verse, like Back to the Future Part 2, is mind-bogglingly ambitious. In fact, there is so much going on in Across the Spider-Verse that it's almost impossible to see it all in just one viewing. In fact, it throws things at you almost near constantly, to the point where you even get little editor's notes like you do in comic books being thrown up on screen almost too quick to even read. And I mean that as a compliment. This is such a densely packed movie. It almost feels like every single thought they had for this follow-up is in here somewhere. And so you have this incredibly rich, massively expanded world with so many different dimensions and also different spider people. It feels like the filmmakers are taking the opportunity to go in all these different avenues they never had the chance before in the earlier movie, and now they are allowed to go completely wild with the concept. But even as I say them, I'm not sure those comparisons are entirely accurate, because while Across the Spider-Verse is by far the most movie can possibly fit in 140 minutes, it's still not a completed story at the end of its running time. That's not entirely true for Back to the Future Part 2 or The Matrix Reloaded, which do have individual conflicts that are set up at the beginning of the movie and then resolved by the end of the running time. Both of those films do have 3-act structures to them, even if they do have storylines that extend out into the next movie. That's not the case with Across the Spider-Verse. I would even argue that this isn't really following a traditional 3-act structure. Act 1 of the movie is before Miles follows Gwen into the portal, and that's about an hour into the movie, and then the second hour is Act 2. It's perhaps a 4-act structure across the two movies. The two-part structure is easily justified by the fact there are so many ideas and concepts that are set up in this movie that it would be a nightmare to try and distill them down into one film alone without them feeling compromised overall. But that means that as a reviewer, I'm in a bit of an awkward situation, because even at the end of this movie, I'm effectively commentating on half a story. And while I have a pretty good idea of where it's going to go in the next outing, especially in terms of its themes and ideas, I won't know until a couple of months down the line. Will my opinion change on Across the Spider-Verse after I see Beyond? Who knows? At this point in time, though, while this doesn't work as well as a standalone feature as Into the Spider-Verse, certainly it has that same creative energy all over it. When we meet Miles again at the beginning of this movie, it's pretty clear that he's stretching himself far too thinly. He's juggling the responsibilities of being Spider-Man with that of being a kid and having to keep his grades up and stay out of trouble. He wants to get to Princeton and also fulfill all of his parents' expectations. But really, he's just burning at both ends. He's doing so much that he can't give anything his full attention. People ask him to do things and he messes things up. He really is kind of struggling to keep a balance between being Spider-Man and being Miles. This is especially seen in an early extended sequence where he as Spider-Man is fighting the Spot, but he's keeping his parents on hold for a meeting at the guidance counselor, and on hold, and on hold, and finally he does actually manage to break away to actually briefly join in that meeting, and then very quickly gets called away to try and finish fighting with the Spot. And so that kind of sums up the dynamic. He's basically not giving anything his full undivided attention. But that scene with the guidance counselor is pivotal to the movie because it sets up the big theme. The guidance counselor effectively asks him, "What's your story?" If the first movie was very much about the fact that anyone can wear the mask, then the second movie is about how you wear it. What choices do you make? What sacrifices have to be taken? What destiny do you forge for yourself, or will it be chosen for you? That is what Miles is deciding all throughout the course of this movie, and in his young brash bravado, he thinks he can do everything and save everyone, and of course, that's not true. That is the ultimate fallacy of being a superhero. With great power comes great responsibility, and as any spider person will tell you, tragedy is an inherent makeup of the identity of Spider-Man, at least seemingly. And so Miles has to maybe learn that lesson over the course of these movies. Perhaps. That is a big thing that Miles comes up against when he encounters Miguel O'Hara, who is Spider-Man 2099. He is a vampiric version of Spider-Man, and he's very much an anti-hero. He's voiced by Oscar Isaac, who definitely is playing him as the most brooding, intense version of the character, and it's very much meant to be a kind of send-up. We've set this idea of storytelling all throughout the movie, and because the film is effectively jumping between universes, it does almost have that kind of choose your own adventure vibe. You kind of choose what universes to tune into, choose what kind of characters you have to focus upon. The way I chose to interpret Miguel was as a commentary on a certain kind of comic book fan that is very fiercely protective of the continuity and history of these characters to a potentially harmful extent. Miguel is fixated on canon events, these defining moments in the identities of these spider people that make them who they are, and if disrupted, could potentially bring down the entire Spider-Verse because it links them all together. It feels like the kind of fan that dictates that every story needs to have these kind of elements and these kind of tropes and storytelling conventions, otherwise it's not a Spider-Man story or whatever superhero story. And there's a lot of moral ambiguity to this because from Miguel's perspective, he feels totally justified. Protecting the multiverse is something that has to be done at all costs because the way he sees it, he's protecting countless lives across endless universes, whereas Miles is only trying to save a few. But Miguel is so ruthless and so without leniency that effectively he ends up becoming the villain. Miguel practically tells him, this is your life, these are the things that are going to happen to you, and you have no say in that. And Miles basically says, I'm not letting anyone write my story for me except myself. And Miles has always been someone that has shattered boundaries and broken through ceilings even when he wasn't aware of it in the first place. But it isn't just Miles' story, it's Gwen's as well. Gwen was one of the most exciting parts of Into the Spider-Verse, and now in this sequel, she's effectively promoted up to being a co-lead. In fact, she is the first thing we meet in Across the Spider-Verse, as her voiceover narration bookends the movie, in that she gives a recap of what has happened to Miles, the hardships that he's faced becoming Spider-Man, but also noting he's not the only one. She has her own struggles with her alter ego, specifically the fact that she's lost Peter in her world, and this is massively expanded in this movie because now her alter ego, Spider-Woman, is being hunted by the police, led by her Captain Father, voiced by Shea Wiggum, who is oblivious to the fact that he is hunting his own daughter. And once that finally comes to pass, Gwen decides that actually she's going to take the multiverse instead. She can't deal with it, so she effectively runs away. And this parallels Miles' struggles in the same way because he is also contemplating revealing his secret identity to his parents, and that decision is something that Gwen doesn't really support because that hasn't really gone very well for her. Gwen's position in the story is amplified by the fact that the pre-title sequence, a fairly lengthy one, is actually centered on her character. The first 15 to 20 minutes of the movie are all about Gwen before we even meet Miles. Miles and Gwen are in very similar positions in their lives, and when they meet back up again, that spark between them instantly reignites, not least of which because Miles has a big crush on Gwen, and he spent much of the year fixated on trying to get back to her. There's that moment where Gwen is going through Miles' stuff in his bedroom, and she finds his drawings, and almost all of them are of her. It's a little bit awkward, if kind of sweet, but the chemistry between them is undeniable, aided by fantastic vocal performances by Haley Steinfeld and Shameik Moore, and those character moments between Miles and Gwen are actually some of my favourite parts of Across the Spider-Verse, and because of the running time, it allows them a lot more room to breathe, it allows you more time with these characters, and that is a huge benefit. But Gwen, like Miles, is deciding what her story is. She's making the choices for herself. She's evolving, and in some ways she's evolving away from Miles, as much as there is obviously a connection between them because they're similar ages and because of their secret identities, but they're going down maybe different paths from one another. There may be some that would argue that the film actually takes a while to get properly started because it's about an hour before we really go into the multiverse stuff when Miles goes through it himself, but I would argue that that's actually the best decision in terms of the storytelling because that first hour of the movie allows us a lot of breathing room with the characters, and especially with Miles's family, especially because it establishes the personal stakes for Miles. Those characters become important later in the narrative. Once that plot engine does actually start moving, it's in overdrive until pretty much the ending of the movie. There's no real room for anything else. So all this stuff effectively being front-loaded, it is necessary overall. But it also stops the movie from succumbing into being a fan service machine. This has been a running problem with multiverses in comic book franchises, where because you can go anywhere and do anything and have multiple versions of the same character, often pulling from franchises' history, there's an easy temptation to just give the fans what they want. Just loads and loads of nostalgia bait, and that's pretty much the entire movie. And don't get me wrong, there is loads and loads of fan service in this movie. There are loads of references and cameos, especially when we're on the Spider-Man world, where there's loads of different versions of the character, and loads of them you can point at and go, that's the one from that, and that's the one from that. The way I feel about fan service is they're like treats. You wouldn't make up a meal entirely of sweets, but because the film is so satisfying in its own right, those little fan service moments feel much more rewarding and much more earned. There's a lot of stuff that's kind of playing on things that have been established in previous Spider-Man films, or even things made by Lord and Miller in the past. But the thing is, those aren't slowing down the movie. We're not stopping the film, essentially, for a gratuitous cameo. The film always remembers that this is about Miles, and the multiverse isn't simply there to give cheap pops for fans, it's to place Miles in new and challenging situations as a character. The animation here is absolutely jaw-dropping. I mean, it takes what the first film did and just runs with it, and you would think, given how revolutionary Into the Spider-Verse was, there wouldn't be that much to expand upon, but boy, would you be wrong. Every time we go to a different world, it's a different art style. The design principles, the way the characters are drawn, I feel like you can tell the characters' individual personalities from just simply the line work, and each of the Spider people that we meet, like Spider-Man India or Spider-Punk, a great supporting turn by Daniel Kaluuya, they all have something that makes them stand out about them, especially on a visual level. Every single choice has been considered, and the result is a feast for the eyeballs, and the animation is so much more visceral, so much more propulsive, and yes, even more emotional. Some of the most striking scenes are on Gwen Stacy's world, where obviously the challenge was to set apart from Miles, and what they came up with was to make the backgrounds less literal. In a lot of shots, especially in close-ups, the background is more of an emotional space for the characters to feel their internalized emotions, and as a result, because a lot of the most emotional scenes in the movie happen in this world, especially with her father, that enriches those moments dramatically, especially the technique that's almost like a watercolour bleeding out. I thought those were absolutely breathtakingly beautiful. The attention paid to form and the experimenting with it, it's not simply style for its own sake. It often directly contributes to what's happening on screen. And at a time where a lot of animated movies getting remade into live action, the Spider-Verse movies are a reminder of of animation strengths as a medium, and the real limit is your creativity. You can't separate the animation from Spider-Verse. The animation is what makes it. The Spot is a great example of this, especially in his character design, in that he's basically a line drawing that hasn't been filled in. You can see the construction of his features faintly, but otherwise he has no real identity because it's been erased. That's the whole point of the character. But the fact that he can open up these holes within himself, that would be really challenging to do in a live action space. But in animation, it's something you can do seamlessly, and it makes total sense. And the Spot has one of the most interesting arcs in the entire movie, because he starts out completely bumbling. He's a scientist. He doesn't know how to be a criminal. He's trying to steal an ATM, but he doesn't know how to do it. He doesn't know how to control his powers properly. So he's trying to go through portals or punching people, and he's hitting himself as often as he's striking his opponents. And he blames Miles for what happened to him, the accident that effectively made him a non-person. His anger is only amplified by Miles's jokes, and that motivates him to become a better villain, to become his nemesis. What starts out as really this comical figure turns into a real legitimate threat, not just for Miles and everyone around him, but potentially a lot of worlds simultaneously. There is a big stretch of the movie where the Spot actually disappears fairly late on, and that makes sense because obviously Miguel takes his place as the antagonist in that stretch of the movie. But before that, Jason Schwartzman does a really impeccable voice performance here, because I think he gets the way that you can start off with a kind of comical character and then take it into a space which is really malevolent and menacing. And certainly the Spot is going to be the character that leads into the next film, and that means that that character has so much more room to expand, even from what we established in this movie. Across the Spider-Verse isn't a perfect movie. I did have some minor complaints. Probably my most major one was that some of the supporting characters from Into the Spider-Verse do get shortchanged here. They have much smaller roles. Peter B. Parker, voiced by Jake Johnson, is back, but he re-arrives into the movie relatively late, and Johnson is fun, but it's a much smaller role in this outing. And I really love the fact that his character became a dad. That really completes the arc that he had in the last movie. But again, I wish there was a little bit more of him in this movie, but this is a really minor complaint because obviously the movie is teasing that those characters will have much more prominence in the next movie. So I can forgive the movie for that, especially because it's dealing with so much and it does that so well that really this is almost petty. The other complaint I had with the movie was the sound mix, and this was actually something I was fully prepared to dismiss as just simply being my screening, but it turned out to be a repeated issue over the course of opening weekend. A lot of people had problems deciphering the dialogue because I think it's actually mixed lower than usual, and this is a bit of a problem in some of the more crowded action scenes, but especially in the very opening of the movie with Gwen's narration where she's playing the drums and the percussion is fighting with the dialogue. At times it's just simply not audible. There were lines that I missed a lot of the time early on in the movie, and it wasn't a case of my cinema playing it too low because a lot of the other stuff was mixed perfectly normally. It's not consistent. It actually seems to improve itself midway through the movie, but because people have so consistently reported that they've had audio issues, I've got to mention it, especially because it really shouldn't be happening with a movie on this kind of scale. I've got to ding the filmmakers for it. Across the Spider-Verse is an astonishing sequel that improves and expands upon its predecessor in many areas. The medium of animation is pushed even further forward in this movie, which is often absolutely breathtaking visually, but also it's just so well written and directed all throughout. You can tell the team working on this movie love the medium that they're working in, are using it to its first potential, but also telling an interesting multiverse story, which is not an easy feat considering that we've been inundated with them in the last year or so. Is it better than Into the Spider-Verse? I would easily say it's equal, but the jury is of course still out because there is that third movie, but the quality that has been maintained across these two films, surely the third film has to carry that on. It would be a big letdown if it didn't, but for now, I think this is an absolutely fantastic sequel, and I simply cannot wait to see beyond, especially after that absolute doozy of a cliffhanger.
You've probably seen this swish thing in the background of the entire video. This is a movie palette. It takes the colour tone of an entire movie and turns it into this artwork. So each of these lines represents a scene or sequences from the entire movie. In this case, this is Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And if you would like a movie palette of your own, then you can go to moviepalette.com and use the code FILMBRAIN15 to get 15% off your order. And thanks again to Movie Palette for sponsoring this video.
If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or with YouTube's Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video, or you can buy some of my merch from my TeePublic page, or you can join my Filmverse at my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, or you can simply like, share and subscribe. Those all help as well. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.